All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to start by introducing myself and my colleague, David Sinjek. So I'm Jay Bearston. I'm the Director of Heritage Outreach at the Historical Society. David just gave a wave. He's my colleague here, and he assists me with Heritage Capital projects, especially the reimbursement side of things. So he does the kind of first pass at reviewing reimbursements after you're a granted organization. So he's here for support on that, and obviously having clear and thorough applications helps with all of those granting things later on in the process. So to start off with, you're in the eligibility review stage 1 workshop for the Heritage Capital Projects Grant Program. This is my contact information. I don't have a lot of slides because we're going to be doing a lot of sharing screen of the guidelines document and the online portal, but I'm happy to share these slides and my contact information. So as I mentioned, David works primarily in the reimbursement process for general inquiries, application questions, application support. I'm the person to contact. So in this early stage, it's primarily me to reach out to. So if anyone is relatively new to Heritage Capital projects, I would recommend checking out the recording of our HCP fundamentals workshop that we hosted about 2-3 weeks ago. It's on our website at washingtonhistory.org/HCP. You scroll down, there's a spot where it says virtual grant workshops, and there's an accordion where you can click on the buttons and see each of those. This workshop will be posted there once we're finished. And then also there will be a third workshop, which we'll be posting there, and you can find the registration link on the website on the same page as well. So the important dates timeline, if you were at the fundamentals workshop, you'll recognize this. We are now at eligibility review workshop here, ticking on down the line there. And this portion of the application will be due on March 29th, so the end of this month, a couple weeks from now. And then this is where we are going to be focusing in the guidelines document today, is the section on eligibility review. And if you did attend the fundamentals workshop, you heard me say that we really restructured the guidelines this year. It's basically all the same content, a little bit of extra explanation on some confusing topics, but we really tried to make it a tool that you can use side by side with your application form. And that's exactly what I'm going to do today in today's workshop, to just kind of show you how I envision that hopefully working and helping you along the process. And then just a quick reminder that we'll have one more workshop, the full proposal. So the next stage workshop is going to be in April 25th. You'll notice that's after the deadline for stage 1. So this is really going to be geared toward folks who have submitted and passed stage 1, and will be, hopefully not a very small group, but a smaller group. It'll be for folks who are able to proceed in the process. So it's a little bit more, lots more content and a little bit more complex part of the application that we'll drill down in. But anyone is welcome to attend. Of course, it's open to the public, so you can register at any time. I just wanted to call that out, that that'll be happening next month. And so our application process is 100% online these days, and that is a requirement. We only accept applications through our Heritage portal, which you can access at that link there, and that's where we'll be focusing our time today. I will say that you do have to register in the Heritage portal in order to use it, and if you haven't gotten started with that, go to that landing page, there is a create an account now button right here, and then I'll get you set up in the portal with that. So that's the quick overview. I'm going to close out the slides and get started on looking at the eligibility review. So this is our guidelines document. You can see that there is a little bit of introductory information here about the portal. And then section 3 here, stage 1 eligibility review. So here's the landing page. I'm going to go ahead and sign in. So this is what the landing page looks like once you're signed in. If you haven't started an application yet, there's a button here to start an application, but I've got an application going already. So I'm going to go into my draft applications here and look at one that I have in progress. So you can see here that at the top, we've got a table of contents. This is very handy because you can bounce to different sections of the application and it'll bounce you up and down on the form. Something to be aware of for this particular platform is that everything is interconnected. So we have the organization profiles and we have the individual user profiles and we have the grant form, and they're all different forms that are exist here in the sort of menu on the left-hand side, and they're all kind of connected to each other. And I'll show you in a minute a little bit more detail about that. And generally speaking, in order to edit a form, you have to use this edit button in the upper right-hand corner. Otherwise, it's basically in view mode. It's just available, the information is saved, but it's only available for viewing. And then down here in the bottom right are the sort of action buttons, and that'll be either in edit or view mode. They change. So in edit mode, it's a save button. In view mode here, it's a withdraw, submit, etc. All right. We're going to hit the edit button and take a look at this form. And as I mentioned before, we're going to keep the guidelines kind of side by side. And we're going to, today, my plan is to kind of go over each section of the guidelines, or each section within this eligibility review section, explain the content there and how it relates to the information you'll be providing on the form. So the way I've organized it is kind of is directly related to the sections that you'll see on the form here. And I have kind of the intro section with the explanation of a lot of the sort of rules and regulations around the program. And then it goes into explaining how to fill out the form. So you'll see organization and personnel. This covers eligible applicants, which we discussed in our fundamentals workshop. Appropriation limits. This is more of an administrative thing that is not represented in the form particularly, because we can see the applications that come in. So this is a policy that we have that you can kind of stack one grant in the future, but you can't stack two. So you can have one active grant project you're working on, and because the time frame is so long, you're permitted to apply for a second one while that current contract is in process. But in order to apply for a third, you're going to have to finish out that open contract. So you only have two kind of open at a time. Another policy is that we do not permit concurrent state funding. So there is limited funding available through the state of Washington. And so we require that you choose one source of funding per biennium and pursue that instead of kind of pursuing every single grant or opportunity that you could potentially be eligible for. And I've listed some specifics here: local community projects, which is basically direct appropriations from your representative. If that's if you're planning to pursue that for this upcoming biennium, you should not also pursue Heritage Capital. And then some other grants through like Building for the Arts, Building for Community, Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation has grants, Recreation and Conservation Office has grants. So pick the grant that most aligns with your project and pursue that. Okay, so then now we've moved into on the form section of this part of the guidelines. So we will go ahead and look at them side by side. So organization name, this should populate automatically. If you're connected to more than one organization and it's showing one organization versus the other, you can just highlight that text and re-enter it to the correct one. And then it asks about the personnel for the project. So as I mentioned, these profiles are all interconnected pieces of data. And what we have here are drop downs that show everyone who's connected to your organization in our system. This is why each person needs to register their own individual account so that their name can show up on this menu, and so that we can have specific contact information for each of those people. Excuse me. So that's why everyone needs to register individually. The primary contact is the person that's going to coordinate with us on the sort of logistics of the grant process. So that's the application. They're the one assembling the application. Later on, they're the one coordinating with me on writing the contract. Maybe they're then later on coordinating with David on submitting reimbursement reports. So they're kind of the main go-to person that we have, that we default contact if we have a question or if we're missing a report or there's something wrong. This person can change throughout the life of a project, either because it's one person submitting the application and a different person doing reimbursements. That's totally fine. Just keep us posted, and we'll just keep this person updated to be the correct person throughout the life of a project. It is important to keep them updated in the system because it does automate some emails and different tasks. And if there's an old name listed here, those automated emails could get missed. The authorized signatory is the person authorized by your governing body to sign legal agreements on behalf of your governing body. So that's typically a board president, could be an executive director, could be a city manager. The person who has the authority to legally commit your organization to this project. Sometimes it's the mayor. It just depends on the functionality of your organization. The project manager is the person who is managing the work of the physical project. So they're out on site, they're working with contractors. They are the ones doing the physical work and have the most familiarity with the project itself. Sometimes there's overlap between these roles, especially in smaller organizations. Sometimes the executive director is the main contact and also managing the project. And in those cases, that's fine to put the same person in some of these roles. However, we do require that the additional contact be somebody else. So we do need at least one other person listed here. So if you're a small organization where the one person is filling lots of roles, be sure to add that additional contact here as someone else, so that if someone's on vacation or there's some emergency or something, that we at least have one other name that we're able to contact. Okay, so all of that, those roles are described here in the guidelines. So if you're trying to remember, oh, what did she say about the project manager? It's all written here. And then it has a note here about once you select those individuals, their information will display on your application form. So that happens not in edit mode, but in view mode. So I'm going to go ahead and save and close this form and show you what I mean. So I've selected all these people. The system is a little a little slow sometimes. You have to be patient with it while the little windmill spins. So now I'm going to scroll down, and it shows each of those people, and it's pulled information about each of those individuals from their profiles, their user profiles. And you can see for Whitney Houston here, she's missing some information in her user profile. So when you see this, this means that you need to go to a different place in the portal to edit it. And you'll also notice I've got some information missing about my organization. You can see this red text here. So in order to fix these issues, I'm going to minimize that. You need to we're going to fix organization first. So I'm going to go to my organization profile. I'm going to go up and click edit. And then it had the type was missing. I'm going to say we're also a couple other things. And then I believe the city was missing. Yes. So I'm going to fill in some information here. Okay. So I'm going to say we only have physical address, so we don't need the mailing address there. So now I'm going to save and close that. Again, we'll have to wait for the spinning wheel. And now I'll have to reload. Look at that. So now up here at the top where the organization information is listed, no red text, everything's all filled in. So now let's go ahead and do that for our signatory. We're going to go to, oh, well, actually I can't because Whitney has her own profile and I'm signed in as Aretha. So what I need to do is have Whitney sign in and then she will click on her user profile and add the missing information there so that we know how to contact. Okay. Back to the guidelines. And we're going to go back into edit mode here. Sorry, I don't mean to scroll so quickly. So next in organization and personnel is the organization mission statement. For nonprofits, that will be easy. For other types of organizations, such as city governments, go ahead and list some type of language that is associated with providing public access to history, which is the purpose of the grant program. Maybe some strategic goal or some planning, you know, comprehensive planning goal or something like that. And you can see in the guidelines here, it makes that note. So if there's not a specific mission statement, you know, where in your organization or your government's officially adopted language is heritage and history mentioned, go ahead and put some of that language in here under mission statement. All right, other state funding. So this is where we ask you what other state funds have gone towards your project, and this is for a couple of reasons. One in particular, you cannot match state funds with other state funds, and so if you've had a previous state grant, that's totally fine. You can sequence. That's all right to have them in sequence, but we want to be able to know, like, oh, you had a grant with Commerce. That's great. We just need a little bit of information about that so that we know that none of that money is eligible as match for your current or the application that you're making now. And that's just so that we know what's going on. So if you have received state funding for this or a similar project, go ahead and hit yes. And then it has a table here to fill out. So you click the plus button to add the agency name, which may be Department of Commerce, Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, the funding program. So that would be, you know, the local communities fund or the historic theaters grant, and then the title, that you received money for, the contract, and the year. So go ahead and just list each of those that are related to the property and project that you're applying for now. Not every single state grant you've ever gotten, but anything related to the property that that you're applying for this round. And then, so that's current or past state funding. And then we have a second question about funding you're currently pursuing. So as I mentioned earlier, you're not permitted to pursue multiple grants at the same time for the same project. So if you do have something else that you're pursuing that's closely related, you'll need to let us know about that. And that's part of eligibility. If you're concurrently applying to Building for the Arts, you cannot concurrently apply for HCP. So that would make you ineligible. However, if you have multiple properties and you're applying for a different state grant for other properties, that's fine. That's unrelated to the application that you're doing now. But go ahead and list that just so we can be aware. All right. And then the next section is conflicts of interest. For anyone who's applied in the past, you can see that we changed how we did this before. In previous years, we required everyone submit a signed conflict of interest form for every single board member and staff member. That was a lot of work. And so we are trying to streamline that this year to be a little bit more, a little less of a heavy lift. And so we have basically some open boxes here. So in the first box, you need to disclose any potential conflicts of interest. And in the guidelines here, I kind of describe what that could potentially be. So a conflict of interest might include personal relationships or familial relationships between board members, between board and staff, between contractors and board or staff, things like that. Again, this doesn't necessarily make you ineligible. It's just best practice to be able to report those conflicts so that everything is above board. I mean, if it's a serious big conflict and we think that it could prohibit your organization's ability to do the project or function legally, then we need to talk about it. But typically, if a conflict is not causing any problems, or it's minor enough that it's not of concern, then we just need it to be stated for the record. So that's what you report in here, is any potential conflicts of your board, staff, and project team. And then in this box, tell us how you know that. So instead of requiring each person to sign a conflict of interest form and upload it to the portal, which we hope you're doing as best practice for your board, having regular intervals of signed conflict of interest statements. But we understand that doing that annually is a lot of work. So maybe you only do it when a new board member comes along, or every 2 years or 3 years. And so trying to give flexibility to grantees to manage conflicts and conflict reporting as their organization does. Go ahead and describe that process here. We collect, every other year conflict statements, or there's, some other reporting process that you use. So go ahead and describe that here. If conflicts are reported, or you describe no process, we will be following up with you to ask you about that and discuss it with you. And if there is a conflict reported, we'll probably ask you to maybe describe that in a little bit more detail, or describe how your organization is mitigating that conflict. Again, nothing that's that's inherently making you ineligible. We just kind of want to manage that information. All right, and finally, at the end of the organization and personnel section, we have attachments. So we ask for a governing body roster with affiliations and your IRS determination letter for nonprofit. So governing body of roster should be names, and affiliations, so professional affiliations. If it's a retired person, go ahead and put, the field that they retired from. Give us a little bit of information about who's on your board, and who's, their sort of professional background and capabilities. And something relatively new is in the guidelines here, we do go ahead and ask, or excuse me, describe each document. Before we kind of just listed them, but I went ahead and these ones are a little bit shorter, but I've described each document, what we're looking for, and kind of the purpose of each document as well. And then I said IRS letter. This is only for nonprofits, but you must have it. You must be a 501c3 organization to apply. If you only have nonprofit status and just at a state level, that is unfortunately not sufficient. It needs to be federal as well. Okay, so that's the first section. That's organization and personnel. And all of the details that I kind of spoke out loud, I included in the guidelines. So in addition to this recording, go ahead and reference each item in the guidelines, and hopefully that will help refresh your memory and guide you as you go ahead and fill this out yourself. I'm going to go ahead and keep moving along, and then we'll open it for questions at the end. So we will next go to project property. Okay, so in the guidelines, we have some information about property control. So the Heritage Capital Projects Grant is public funds, and as part of that, the state requires that the granted organization have long-term long-term property control, and as part of the grant agreement, provides public access to history for a period of 13 years past project completion. So something to note is that if you receive a grant and you're not able to complete it in the biennium, of course, we hope you will, and we'll support you and encourage you to finish it on time as best you can. But sometimes things get delayed, and we have there are some projects that get reappropriated, which means they get an extension basically into the next biennium. If that happens, then your 13-year monitoring period then also gets bumped forward. So that's something to consider, as if you don't own your property, if you're under a lease, as the project is delayed, so too does the 13-year monitoring period get extended. So during that 13-year monitoring period, we want you to be reporting back to us, basically that you're maintaining the property in a way that people can enjoy it and use it, and that you're continuing to provide public access to history through interpretation, through historic preservation standards, and we ask that you submit, or we require that you submit a short report in the portal annually for 13 years, basically just giving us an update on the property. Things are still good, still providing public access to history. If you end up applying for multiple HCP grants over a couple of different biennium, we've set it up in the system where, excuse me, if it's for the same property, you don't have to submit double reports. If you have 2 grants for the same property, we'll just kind of retire the older one and go with the 13-year monitoring for the most recent project. All right. The next section is DAP and tribal consultation. This is a little bit different this year. Last time we required that folks individually reach out to any tribe that identified their location in their usual and custom lands. And that created a lot of work for not only our grantees, but a lot of extra work for tribes. And really, as a state agency, it is more appropriate for us to work with tribes on a government-to-government level. So this year, what we're doing is we're going to compile information from all of your applications, into basically a packet, and with the assistance of our tribal liaison, Pam James, share that information with all of the tribes in Washington state. And we want to try to curate that information so that we're presenting the projects we think will be of most interest, but of course, we will give them the opportunity to comment on any project that they wish, because this is state funds and we have to follow state regulation. And there is review that happens with capital projects and with tribes. So, however, that does mean, that does not mean, I should say, that if there is an issue that a tribe brings up, that the grantee has no responsibility. So you'll be responsible for coordinating with us, with the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, with the tribes in finding a solution if there's an issue. Typically, there are not a lot of issues that we come across, but you never know, especially with new construction. Things, archaeological resources can be found. So I will go ahead and point out that the process with the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation has not changed. So you do still need to contact them about historic resources. You need to reach out to them. And for this stage 1 application, you just need to initiate, which means, you submit your easy project review form that has information about your property, your project, and you send it off to the 2102 email address, which is here in the guidelines, before you submit your stage 1. So that process is described in pretty good detail here in the guidelines for you to refer back to later. Okay, so those are the rules we're working around, and now we've got on the form here in the guidelines. So first, your project property section starts with the property name. Again, this is a drop-down because it's connected to other profiles in the system. And for this account, I've got 2, and you'll see that it doesn't display any information until, again, I go out of edit mode and into save mode. So we'll go ahead and do that, and I'll show you what that looks like. Come on, scrolling down. So here it is. So project property, project type, site control, address, legislative district, year built. So just a quick summary of the project is imported here from your project profile, excuse me, property profile. If you need to change any of that information, you will go over here to properties, click on your property profile here. Here's the property information that was imported into the application form. You can see there's additional information that you can fill out, including historical designation. So go ahead and fill all that in as you're making edits. And then lastly, this is in the guidelines under the sort of portal section. But if you don't have your property, if that drop down on your application form is blank, that means you haven't created a profile for your property yet. And it's a little bit not intuitive how to do that, but you go to your organization profile. Scroll down to the property section and hit this plus button. Fill in the name and the type, hit save, reload the page, and then it'll show up in the left-hand menu for you to add more information to. And it will show in your dropdown on your grant application as well. Okay, going back to the application form, to project property. All right, after you've selected your property and made sure that your property is, all the extra information on the profile is accurate, the next thing is public visitation at your site. So give us a sense of, this is open-ended because some folks are open seasonally, some folks have school groups visit, give us a sense, describe as in whatever way makes sense for your organization, how the public interacts with your property and how much. The description of that here in the guidelines. So for tribal and DAP consultation on the form, we're going to be asking you if any part of your project will involve ground disturbance or site work. And that is so that we can understand whether there's a likelihood of, not likelihood, but potential for archaeological resources to potentially be found. So if you are doing any sort of new construction or really major rehabilitation where there's going to be ground disturbance, go ahead and select yes, and then just describe what that will be, so that we can provide some information to the tribes to let them know. A lot of projects that the fund have no ground disturbance. We do fund new construction, but it's more often existing building rehabilitation. You're replacing a roof, or you're doing a new HVAC, things like that. And so in that case, you could say no. And then here is the date of DAP consultation initiation. So that means that you've submitted your form to DAP for them to start reviewing your project. In the guidelines, it mentions this, but it can take them several weeks to go ahead and process that, because they are reviewing and processing every single capital project that is funded by state dollars, including transportation projects and everything related to state funding, and a lot of federal funding as well. They are a very busy department. So that's why we require you to start your consultation with them at this stage. You don't have to complete it, you just have to start it, so that in several more weeks, when you're wrapping up your application, we've given DAP enough time to respond to your form. So list the date that you sent the form or that you talked to folks there. And then we will be following up with DAP to confirm that and to see if they would like any other information from you about your project. Oh, it looks like I didn't add the other required documents here. I will have to add those plus buttons to the form. For attachments for stage 1, we've got documentation of long-term site control. So that needs to be property deed with your name on it if you own it, or evidence of a long-term lease with those terms and those dates clearly spelled out, something like that. If you have a question about whether your document constitutes like long-term site control, contact us and we'll talk about it. It does have to be legally binding. So if it's something like an MOA or an MOU, that's typically probably not sufficient unless it's a, pretty, it would depend on the language, but and the partners. I do want to point out that a long-standing month-to-month lease is not considered long-term site control. I know there's some organizations out there who have been in their buildings for 40 years and they have a month-to-month agreement with their city, and they're not interested in renegotiating that for whatever reasons. If that's the case for you, contact me. Let's talk about it and see what other options there might be. I didn't mention this earlier, but to add a document, you go ahead and hit that plus button, and it'll have this window where you can drag files or add files. And if you click the plus button on these items that are listed on the form, it will automatically label that document that you're uploading with this title. But you can also add more if you want to with this plus button on the box, which let's see if I can just drag and drop. And so once you do that, then you pick what label you want to add to that particular document if you're using the plus on the box. And I'll just show you, if you use the plus with the line, it here automatically labels it for you. It's really helpful to label your documents when we're reviewing. So you should be keeping that in mind, especially if you're adding multiple documents in here. And I apologize for not having those other required documents listed on the form here. That is an oversight. I will correct. So other documents about your property that you should submit are some pictures of your building exterior. Don't need to go wild with this, just a handful of good representative photos, four or five would be great. And then images of a general setting or site. So we can kind of get the sense of not just the details of the structure, but kind of where it's located. And then for properties where you have multiple buildings, it really is helpful to have a site plan so that we can understand the relationship between your buildings. This doesn't have to be super complicated. It can be a, neatly hand-drawn document. It can be a screenshot of Google Maps that's labeled, just something that gives us a sense of where the buildings are, especially the buildings that are intended for grant funds. Okay, so that's project property for stage 1. And now we will move into project proposal. So in the guidelines, I've got a lot of the information we covered in those fundamentals, in the HCP fundamentals about eligible project expenses and ineligible expenses. So you can, of course, review that at your as you need. And then the section describing what an element of work is. So this is something that we started last cycle, and we feel like asking in the application, and we feel like it's a good way to organize project scopes. Previously, scopes had been organized by architectural divisions, which is often how contractors will put together contracts and different things like that. But for the purposes of monitoring a grant contract and understanding work as it goes in phases, we have found this to be a much more kind of usable structure, so that we're continuing with the elements of work structure. So what that means is we'll have the scope of work. The scope is the entirety of all of the work that you're doing for your grant project, and the elements are kind of identifiable related sections of that work. You could think of it as phases. So for instance, I have on here design and planning, structural rehabilitation, these kind of more discrete portions. And each project is going to have its own list of elements. So, if you're building a whole new building, then that's going to be a different list of discrete portions of work than someone who's, redoing their roof and rehabilitating the historic parlor. Those are just different descriptions. Those descriptions will be organized differently, and that's totally fine, which is why we're leaving it very open-ended for you to kind of tell us what parts of work you're planning to accomplish. So this is going to be probably the thing that we ask most people to edit after stage 1. We'd really like to get your list of elements organized in a way that makes sense to both you and us, makes sense with the work that you're proposing. And so that's why we're asking for them in this first stage instead of later in stage 2. Something to be aware of, compliance with applicable law. So we already talked a little bit about I mentioned earlier 2102, which is the executive order that requires tribal and DAP consultation. Prevailing wage law, there's information a little bit later in the guidelines about that. And then these others, you are required to follow state laws using state funds. So the two that we sort of deal with most regularly are the DAP and tribal review, of course, and then the other one we get most questions about is prevailing wage. So you are responsible to communicate to your contractors that they must use prevailing wage for the whole project. So that includes your match. and to follow the guidelines and rules of the Labor of Department Industries. It's so it's a lot of, it can be a lot of work. We understand that, and we'll do our best to help you, but it is required.
But to clarify, it's not retroactive.
Good point. Yes, thank you, David. So because we allow previous work to count towards your match, you don't have to retroactively go back and show prevailing wage that was previously paid on your project. That's a great, really important point. So after your project is awarded grant funds, and actually it's the day that the governor signs the bill, I believe, is when that kicks in for your project, which will be a couple of months before you have access to grant funds. So usually it happens in about mid to late May, and then you can start having access to grant funds in July. So yeah, once the money is allocated to your project, then the prevailing wage requirements kick in on that day the governor signs the budget with your project in it. But before that, it's not retroactive. You don't have to go backwards and repay. Okay, so project proposal on the form. This is a title for your project to help orient us around it. Descriptive words typically include the name of the property in it, because this is what will be included in the submission to the legislature. So it's helpful if the property is in there. Type of project, we've got a drop down here for you. If you're doing more than one, for instance, rehabilitation of historic facilities plus design, architectural, engineering services, if more than one of these applies to your project, go ahead and pick the one that you're planning for the grant funds to be spent toward. And then project summary and project timeline. Again, and all these things that I'm kind of stating out loud are here in the guidelines to remind you when we go ahead and start filling this out for yourself. So the project summary, there is limited space here, but you need to give a description, a summary description of the project you are planning that includes everything, including your match. And then this is another piece I think that's going to be the most important to clarify during this stage one. So if you're using past work as match that you've done in the last 6 years, all of that has to be described in your application form, including the summary and including in your elements of work here in your timeline, and in stage 2 in your scope of work. Because when we put together your contract, we have to list all of the work that's included as match funds in the scope of work in the contract, so that when we are processing your reimbursement, we can reference your contract and that work, and we've agreed that that you're doing all of these different pieces of work for both match and grant funding. So project summary needs to include everything match and grant funded, and it does say that here in the guidelines. So similarly, with the timeline, each element of work and include everything that will be grant or match, including past work already accomplished. So here on the form, we've got the timeline, and do your best to outline these elements of work as they fit to your project. And then as part of the review of your application, we'll work with you to kind of reformat them if needed. You can go ahead and add roof replacement, and let's say that this is going to be starting, we'll say 2025, August 1st. And this is going to be both grant funded and match funded. And sorry, these boxes don't line up super well, a little bit wonky on the form. And then we'll put some dates here. We'll do 2026. Oops. Struggling with these clicks. Okay, and that's going to be all grant funded. So the purpose of this section, in addition to outlining your elements of work, is to make sure you understand that the dates of the project work that's happening and what can be grant funded and match funded. So I've got some important dates here in the guidelines to remind you. We do allow you to go back up to 6 years from the first day of the biennium, which would be July 1st, 2019 for match. So if you have any dates here listed before July 1st, 2019, that's a red flag for us. Like that can't count because it's too early. Similarly, if you have anything between 2019 and 2025 listed as grant funded, that's also another red flag because that can only be match. So again, this does not mean you're ineligible if you happen to have something that misaligns, but that's just something that we need to know upfront so that we can talk to you about it and figure it out and either adjust as needed, or maybe there's some misunderstanding about what can and can't be used and the timing of that. So again, if you make any mistakes, it's not a process where it's like, oh, that's wrong, you're ineligible, you're done. This is a process where we're reviewing key pieces of your application and working with you to adjust those as needed before you then dive into the full proposal, which requires a lot more description of the scope and project narratives and bids and budgets and all those things. So we want to make sure that we understand all of the components and everybody's on the same page about what counts where and the timing of everything before you launch into all of the detail of your project. So we hope that everyone will pass the eligibility review because we will, if there's a mistake or some issue found, we'll work with you to mitigate that or to adjust that so that it does work for the program. The only reason that you would sort of not pass the eligibility review is if you're not the right type of organization, if you don't have property control for the right amount of time, or if you can't produce any, match. So those are kind of the big reasons why you would have to stop at this stage. Okay, cruising right along. The last section for stage 1 is the budget section. So in stage 2, we will ask for a much more detailed project budget. But for stage 1, we're just asking for these high level kind of categorical expenses, which are construction rehab, which this will be most people's money is in this section. Design and pre-construction. So that's, well, here, actually, I've outlined it in the, here in the guidelines. So construction of new facilities, work on existing facilities. Design and pre-construction includes conditions assessments, architectural engineering, permitting, and then property acquisition is purchasing of property or the value of donated property. So those are the 3 main categories we're asking you to organize all your dollars into. Come back up to the rules here. So we'll talk through some of these details about funding in your budget. So Heritage Capital Projects has a 2-to-1 required match, which means for every dollar that you receive in grant funding, you have to show $2 in match. There are some restrictions on those dollars, namely they cannot be other state funds, which I mentioned earlier. There is an allowance for up to 6 years before the first biennium day, which I mentioned earlier also, so that's July 1st. And then for larger projects or projects where the grant is over $100,000, only half of your match can be in kind. So you have to have at least half of it as cash. For small projects, you can have any ratio, which means basically you're allowed to have more in-kind match if it's a smaller project. So what is cash match versus in-kind match? Cash match is funding that is basically in the accounts of the grantee organization and is paid to the contractor or the architect or whomever is doing the work of the project. So that money comes into your account in some way, where it's an income that you're earning or donations that you received, and that's an expense of the organization who is the grantee and with whom we have a contract. In-kind match is anything contributed to the project from a third party. So that can be volunteer hours, that can be an architect donating their time, that could be if you are a museum that is in a city building, that could be the city saying, hey, we'll replace the roof, and then you can do the rest of the project and you can use that as match. That's in kind because the city would be then paying the contractor to replace that roof. So that is capital improvements made by someone other than the applicant organization. So that's something to be aware of. If you have a really strong project partner, if they are the ones actually paying for the expense, then that becomes an in-kind dollar. If it's a strong project partner that's giving you a big grant and the money is coming to the organization and the organization is paying the contractor, that's all cash. It really depends on how the funds are routed. And if you have questions about that, please contact us and we will help you understand that. I already mentioned the cost categories here, and they're represented here. And then a little bit extra information about prevailing wage and some instructions on talking to labor and industries. Another important point is that we do retain 3% of your grant, excuse me, for administration purposes. So you'll see on the form here, in fact, we can just, it's a short on the form section. But you can see as you enter an amount here, it'll reduce 3% and tell you what your actual reimbursable amount in the future will be. So be sure to be aware that that the actual cash you receive will be less 3%. You are more than welcome to increase your ask, and in light of that, you will just need to also increase your match to compensate for that. So in this section, you will be listing, again, broad numbers for each of these categories. How much money will be spent in cash, how much will be donated in kind, and how much you're requesting in grant funds under that category. And list each of those out. The form will calculate. You may have to reload it. So, or well, don't reload it, hit save. So if you hit save, well, here I can actually make some changes and show you the changes. But let's do. Okay, so the numbers updated down here. So again, you may have to click save a couple of times. The form sometimes takes a cycle or two to get everything updated. So if you've saved and you're still seeing numbers that are incorrect, try a couple more times. Okay, and that is the stage 1 eligibility review process. rules and form. So with that, I will go ahead and maybe stop sharing if and until we need to review to any or refer to any of those guidelines or the form. Okie dokie. I'm opening up the chat to start there. And thank you to the AI assistant. Thanks, Mark. My little microphone just ran out of battery, so we'll have to go to speaker sound. Hopefully it's still clear. Yes, you can see I had a lot of fun sample names in there just to get my test applications sorted. So we've got a question from Sam, which I think got sent as a direct message, but I'll go ahead and read it out loud. I'm a port district that sits inside of a historic district seeking funds to provide the public access to a repurposed historic church. Historical interpretation has been part of our port planning documents since 1992. How do I address the quote mission statement when it's not explicit in our comp plan? It doesn't have to be the comp plan, Sam. It could be some other document. It could be some other, you know, process that the port went through or the city went through. If there's literally no official adopted statement, maybe let's chat about that and see what options there might be out there for you. But yeah, comp plan was just an example. If there's something else, some other planning document or city document that, or port was, I guess not city for you, port document, we can chat more about that. All right, Josh O'Neill, the city is looking at various ways to save money. Big picture, and one item is merging our 2 libraries into a larger system outside the city and thus selling it. This has been in discussion for 8 years. I have been here, so I don't expect it to happen. If it does in 5 to 8 years and we sell the property as part of the merger, how do we repay the grant? How does this situation work? Yeah, you are not permitted to sell your property during the monitoring period of 13 years. So you would have to repay the grant with interest. And that would be to the state of Washington. I've not managed that process because we've not had anyone repay a grant in my time here. And so I could get more information from you, but I would, if this is a possibility, it seems like maybe this is not quite the right grant program because of that long-term piece. The point of the program really is that long-term planning, long-term public access to history. So if there's not a long-term commitment here from the library and city to keep this asset in the community, then I think this is maybe not the right grant program for you. But we can talk more about that if you still want to pursue. We can chat more, Josh. All right, Mark asks if we received monies in the past 6 years from WSHS and were in flux earlier, do we start another account or stay with the existing account? Yeah, stay with the existing account. Even if you've switched organizations, we can reorient you to the correct organization within the system. Keep your information, and maybe it needs updating, like a new email and a new phone number. But we can kind of keep your name in the system and connect it to whichever organization is appropriate. So yeah, you should be able to log back in and see all the stuff. And part of the point of the system is that it keeps information over time. So you can see your past grants. You can see the reports you've submitted on those past grants. Well, within the last couple of years for those more recent grants. And I will just say, let me share our screen real quick. If you know that you've had an account before, but you have no recollection, go ahead and just click this forgot password link.
It'll take you to this page, and you just enter your email, and it will send you a reset link. It will probably go to spam. It comes from like a do not reply 17 dash something 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 at flux.io. So it does look very spammy. So be sure to check spam and then maybe mark that as a safe sender for your list. If you don't remember which email you used at the time, you can reach out to me and I will check our system and figure out where you're at with that. Great question. Yes, please use your existing accounts where they exist. And Sam, do I include past work on my historic building in the project timeline if I'm including that work as part of my match? Yes, 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 yes. Please include everything that will be included as match. Timeline, summary, and then in stage 2, the scope of work. You'll have to describe that scope that's already done in a fair amount of detail, so all of that is documented in the scope. For past projects being used as match, must they be divided into separate elements, thus front door rehabilitation as one whole project, or divided into front door rehabilitation design and front door rehabilitation construction? Holly, that is up to you. I would say probably simplify would be my suggestion, especially in this particular example. I would say go ahead and propose what you think makes most sense to you, and kind of we'll work with you to understand that all together. So we don't want it like too broad where you're like building rehabilitation, and that's one element. That's a little bit too broad, but we don't need 20 elements of work. Typically, most of our contracts are somewhere between, well, sometimes it is one, like it's a fairly small project, or it's just one thing happening like a roof replacement. But typically they range from anywhere between, I would say like 4 to 8 elements, David, does that sound about right? Usually yeah, like a handful, and sometimes a larger handful, sometimes a smaller handful. So that's typically where we see them landing, and that can give you an idea of, you don't need to list every single item that's being rehabilitated. Maybe list it by space or by time frame, just kind of a way to organize that information that makes sense for your project. Great. Okay, Mike asks, how do we, if possible, use volunteers as part of our match? Great question, Mike. So volunteer labor is valued this cycle at $37 per hour. And that's in the guidelines, so that you can remember that number. And how volunteer labor needs to be documented is you need to have the volunteer have their name, the dates they worked, the number of hours they worked that day, and a short description of the work that was done. Doesn't have to be super long, but it does have to relate to the scope and the elements of work you're including. So it has to be detailed enough that we can tell that they've spent that time on this project. For past labor, if over the last 6 years you've had volunteers working on your project, the best practice really is to have contemporaneous timesheets for those volunteer folks. We recognize that sometimes, volunteer labor was spent, maybe not documented as thoroughly, and then later you're deciding to apply for a grant where you need that documentation. If that's the case for you, reach out, let us know what you have. We'll work with you to see if there's enough information to count those hours in the grant match. But moving forward, especially for, well, basically starting now, any volunteer work happening that you plan to count as match, and certainly anything after you're under contract with us, if you do receive a grant, needs to be documented contemporaneously, which means like at the time that it happened. So we don't want, 6 months into the process being like, oh, quick, let's put together a bunch of timesheets from 6 months ago. The idea is that those volunteers should be tracking their hours as they go. and recording a little bit of detail about the work that they're doing. You can also have professionals be volunteers, as far as, you know, if a professional is donating their professional labor, and that labor can be valued at their professional rate. So, I mean, they'll need to document that they are a professional and say, you know, I would have charged this number of dollars for this scope of work that I did for this project, and I'm donating it. You know, they'll need to document that. So one other thing to mention, though, that it does need to be donated labor in their area of expertise. So if you have an architect who's volunteering to paint for you, that just gets counted at the volunteer rate, because they are not an expert painter, they're an expert architect. So it does need to be within their professional skill set. Louise asks, can cash match be counted if we are packing things together until we can say replace, say, a roof, HVAC, etc.? Can we use that money we have to use until we get some funding help? Louise, this depends. So we cannot fund and we cannot accept as match maintenance. This is a capital grant, which means it has to be basically a major improvement to a physical property. However, there are some things that need to be undertaken in order to stabilize a building in preparation for a capital project, or stabilize a site or something like that. So if this work that you're doing is directly in preparation for a capital project to stabilize the property, then it would be eligible. But if it's like, oh, a couple of years ago we patched the roof, and a couple of years ago we replaced some pieces of the HVAC or replaced some filters, like that's all really considered maintenance, and that is not eligible. So, well, it's a fine distinction, but it really depends on kind of the purpose of that work. David,
Jay, it's not a fine distinction. Our roof has been leaking on our collection, and we're just trying to save it. And
that sounds like
yeah,
that sounds like roof stabilization and preparation for a capital project to me. So
yes,
that sounds good.
Thank you so much.
Great. Okay, Jody, please explain how staff or volunteer can be used as match. So I mentioned volunteer hours before. They need to be recorded on a timesheet, hopefully, preferably best practices at the time that it's happening. Staff time, that's another different kind of similar but different. So if you have an organization that has professional staff that is working on the physical project itself, so this is not like administration, this is not like board stuff, they are actually doing physical work on the project. The salary or hourly rate you're paying your staff person can count toward your project. But we do need to see specifically that staff time was logged on the project. So you're going to have some way to, on their timesheets or however they're reporting, note which hours that they are spending. If you have a staff person whose literally whole job it is to do just this project, then that could be that, then maybe we don't need the detailed timesheets accounting. But if they're not spending all of their time on this project, then you really have to have some type of thing in your timesheet software that lists, I worked on this project on this day for this many hours as part of the work. And I should back up. If this person is 100% working their time on this project, they still have to document the work that they're doing. We can't just say like, oh, that's a person who's working on the project, we'll just keep paying their salary. That still has to be recorded somewhere, and reported that this is this person's job and this is the work they've been doing over this period of time. So I misspoke a little bit there earlier. We do not accept percentages as an estimate of time spent. So that is something that has been a little bit gray area in the past. So you can't be like, well, this person spends about 20% of their time on this project. We're just going to submit their timesheets and at 20%. Like that does not work. We have to have documentation of the time spent on the project by that person. Does that answer your question, Jody? Okay, great. All righty, Karen. Oh, Karen had to run. For budget section, do we fill in the amounts for the phase for which we are seeking funding or for our total work, including the match? Oh, great question, Holly. And I didn't mention at the time, I should have reiterated, it has to be everything. So you'll see including match. So let me see if I can pull that back up quickly. So yes, the budget does need to include all of your match numbers and your grant requests. All right, so going back down to the budget section here. So this is how it looks in view mode. When you enter, it'll calculate all your cash, your in-kind, your grant, and it'll, in fact, this should be showing an error because I'm not I don't have enough match here. So I'll have to check why that's not showing me an error because it should be. Try reloading it. So yes, that's a great question. And that's why in each of the sections, down, we include the match as separate box. Really important point. Thanks for bringing that up, Holly. All right. Dale asks regarding nonprofit status. We are a church with a group exemption to the larger denomination. We do not file a 990. We do for our trust. Should I apply as the trust or as the church? Well, Dale, that depends. Who has property control? It sounds like if they're separate organizations, it needs to be the person with property control. And if that organization that has property control is not an eligible organization type, then this might not work out. So
okay, to clarify, a church by definition is it's a nonprofit organization. We just don't file our Form 990s because we're part of a larger organization that does that job. This may not be a fine detail for which you care, but anyway, that's about all I have.
So Dale, who owns the property? Is it the larger organization that owns the property?
Yeah, the church. The trust is simply a financial tool that has been used for solicitation to capture funds that exist strictly for the purpose to serve the church.
Yeah, so churches are eligible if they have 501c3 status. So
Yeah.
if it's the larger organization that has that 501c3 status and owns the property, then they would need to be the applicant.
Larger organization. Oh, okay. I might take this conversation offline.
Yeah, we can chat more. Give me a call or send me an email. We can chat on those details.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Peggy asks, can amounts be estimates? All our volunteer hours going back to 2019 to 2020 valued at $37 an hour. Great questions, Peggy. Yes, so amounts can be estimates for the purpose of the application only. So yes, for now, you can estimate if you are granted and later in the future, you will have to be documenting those hours more precisely. Exactly. So the number of hours that you're counting towards your project, you will have to demonstrate in timesheets. And yes, everything, even old volunteer hours, it's all $37 an hour for this grant cycle. Good question. Lynn asks, we've received funding that might include state monies, but isn't administered by the state, i.e. barn grant, third places, both administered by the trust. Can these be included in the match? They cannot. Those are state monies that are, they go through the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, and they contract with the trust to operate those grants, but that is state money that is in the state budget. So unfortunately, that cannot count as match. Wanda asks, what kind of official documentation is best for in-kind or volunteer hours or time? So that's the timesheets that I mentioned before, including name, date, hours worked, and description of time, description of the work done.
Okay. Jay, I have one other tag on.
Sure, go ahead.
One of the things that I had thought I heard, I may be wrong, but they cannot use volunteer time for attending meetings, like on a planning commission team or any kind of staff meeting. It has to be on site. I'm sorry about my phone. It has to be on site. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, yes, generally speaking, yes. So Wanda and I have talked about this a little bit, but in the past. So yeah, like planning meetings, board meetings, staff meetings, those types of things, even if the project is being discussed, those meetings are really for a different purpose. And so that does not count as volunteer time.
Okay.
However, if you are going on site to talk to the contractor, or even if you're meeting a contractor at their office, or some meeting whose purpose is directly related to the physical work of the project, that can count as time. So it really depends on the purpose of the meeting. But typically when people are talking about meetings, they're talking about board meetings and staff meetings and things like that, and those are not eligible time.
Okay, so let me clarify. So if they are attending on-site meetings at the location, that would count.
Yeah, as long as they're talking about the project.
Okay, it has to be on the purpose of the project.
Purpose
And
of
if
the
they go-
project, yeah.
And if they go to, say, for instance, a meeting that deals with permits with the city, would that also count?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So it has, in Wanda, it really does have to be, yeah, just focused on the work of the project that's in the
Okay.
scope. That's
Okay.
the reference kind of point that's best to use is, are they talking about, are they working on the scope, advancing the scope of the project?
Okay.
So like long-term visioning, long-term planning, that type of stuff is important work. Don't get me wrong. It's very important work and I would love to see it happen. But it really is beyond the scope of the physical work of the project that's in the contract.
Okay.
Great
Thank you.
question, though.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, Shelley asks, our project will be for a variety of renovation projects throughout our museum. Can you discuss using earned income as cash match? The guidelines say we can use membership fees, property leases, facility rental fees, fees for services, etc. I assume that would also include admission fees. We need add additional expenses to our project to account for those earned income dollars that we use as match. For example, normally facility rental funding would pay for things like the executive director's salary, toilet paper, and light bulbs. Do we need to redirect that funding to our capital project expenses, or are we just concerned with using the match in the revenue section as our budget? Okay, this is a long question. And it brings up an important point. So the purpose of the match represented in the application, especially in stage 2, we'll talk about this in more detail, is to demonstrate that you have the financial capacity to pay for the totality of the project, which includes the work that's going to be done as paid for by grant, and also the work that's going to be done paid for by match. So at the end of it, you're going to have needed to, if you're asking for $100,000, you're going to have to show us $300,000 total in expenses that you've paid for or that were donated. In the application, and in stage 2, we're going to be asking, what is the income that you're using to pay for that? And that's mainly to check that it's not, actually, it's mainly to check that it's not other state dollars, and that you have it, or you have a plan to get it in the sort of reasonably near future.
Oh, okay.
What we want to avoid is someone saying, I'm going to apply for $100,000. And yeah, there's $200,000 of match. We'll figure that out later. And then they get into the project and they're not able to figure it out later. And now we can't get the project. Now we've tied up $100,000 that has no match. And the project just doesn't happen and no one else got to use that money. All of that said, when you present your match or your match income in stage 2, which this is getting a little bit into the future here for folks, we want to see that it's there. We want to see that you have financial assets and that you're able to move forward. We do not track that dollar to dollar into your grant and reimbursements in the future. We ask for documentation of the assets that you have, the income that you have, and where you're getting it in the application. That goes in your contract. And then the reimbursement process is a completely separate process where you are spending money. And frankly, as long as you're not having any new income sources that are state related, we don't really care whether that's admission fees or membership fees or a grant, because you're spending the money. You're going to show us that you spent the money and you're going to request for reimbursement for 1/3 of that money in the future. So we ask for the match income in the application to basically show capacity, but we don't ask you to track that income dollar for dollar later in the process. It's there's kind of a switch that happens, after you're granted. It's like, all right, you've demonstrated and we trust that you've provided accurate information about your financial capacity. And then we work with you in the future as you start spending that money. Is that clear?
Kind of. I'll have our finance person talk to you more about it. The reason I asked is because typically if I'm doing a project budget for, let's say, a clothing bank, and there's $100,000 received in donated clothing, we put $100,000 in the revenue section of our budget, and then in the expense section of our budget, we put $100,000 in-kind donated clothing there as well. There's no money that comes in and out for that $100,000. So it's just, general project budget practice to have the expenditure and the income match. The last time I did one of these projects was like 10 years ago. And part of the project was for moving a small building to the site. And so we asked for funds. This is for a different organization. We asked for funds to move the building. We were able to use the cost of the building, the value of the building, as part of our match. And I was not involved in the expensing for it or anything like that. So I don't know how that exactly worked, but that actually enabled us to ask the Heritage Capital projects for more money, because that increased the value of our project and the amount of the match. So I'm just having trouble getting my head around how that will work for this particular project when you've got money, or in the case of volunteer time, for example, there's not an expense going out, because you're just pretending kind of that the income's there. I mean, I know you're not, but you're saying, here's the value of our volunteer time. It's not you're not pulling your wallet out or anything. So just trying to figure that out.
No, this is all really important stuff, really important to understand. And this is the most complicated part. so it's worth kind of talking it through and really understanding. And we've got another half hour, so we've got time. So not that we have to spend the next half hour on this topic, just meaning we can take a little time to dig into this. So what I think is important to understand is that in-kind value, it can count towards your project. And so you don't need to record, let's see, how should I phrase this? So for in-kind value, the income and the expense are the same thing, right? So you've got someone who's donated, let's say 100 hours. That's to the project. That value then is an expense on the reimbursement side of of the project. So there are things that you submit in your application that's in-kind value that, yeah, no money is exchanging hands, but you're representing that value in your application as, you know, volunteer labor, maybe professional labor, maybe materials. And then later when we're reimbursing, you'll probably submit that exact same documentation. Like, yep, remember we said we had this value before and here's the value that can be counted toward the reimbursement. So you should count those dollars in your budget here as that dollar value budget in the in-kind, on the in-kind line. And then everything that needs to be paid for with cash then needs to be represented by some type of match income that's a cash-based income like you've listed in your question here. So what I would suggest, and I would be happy to kind of like take a look at some numbers for you to see if you're understanding, and that goes for anyone. If you've got questions about some specific numbers or a specific piece of your application and you're looking for some feedback, and that's actually why this whole stage 1, stage 2 thing is, so that we can actually have a check-in point and make sure everyone's understanding. What I would say is maybe start by putting together your whole project budget and saying, you know, we're going to count this much value of in-kind, which will allow us to increase our grant request because we've got that in-kind value too. And then we only have to demonstrate this much of the cash match that we're planning to use. And so working out all those levels so that the 2-to-1 is correct and you're maxing out the amount of grant that you can ask for based on a combination of what is being donated and the amount of cash that you have and, you know, anticipate having over the next 2 to 3 years over the course of the project. Does that make sense?
Somewhat, but that's okay. I'll have, I know Vicky's on this call too, so I'll have Vicky or somebody else talk to you. I'm the grant writer, so
Okay.
And we've already set up kind of a budget thing where we're going back to 2019 and looking at what have our capital projects been, and what can we then use as a match. And along those lines, I should ask a corollary question. I assume that dollars used for a match for our Heritage Capital project that ended in 2021 could not then be used again for a match for this project. Again, we're doing a kind of a whole organization, whole museum renovation. There's projects all around it. So there's a lot of things that could potentially fit in with the match. But I assume they've been used, we can't use them again.
That's correct. Yep, that's an important point. Yes. So if you've used some expenses to match a previous grant, HCP or otherwise, if you have gotten other state grants that require a match, like a bunch of the commerce grants require a match. If you've gotten a commerce grant in the past and you've used expenses as match for that state grant, you can't double dip and use it again. So
got it. Thank you.
Yeah, so Shelley, I'm more than happy to chat with you specifically. We can pull up some numbers and it really is a kind of a math and numbers game of trying to get the 2-to-1 match, understanding the scope of work, understanding your like revenue streams and basically how much you have on hand. Are you planning to spend out some endowment? Are you planning to spend out future earned income? You know, it really depends on each organization's situation, how you're planning to pay for this in the future. Because I didn't mention this at the top, I probably should have. It's a reimbursement only grant. So you have to spend the money first before you can get the grant funds reimbursed. We talked a lot about in the fundamentals workshop. So we have to kind of come up with a scheme of funding where you know, you have enough on hand to be paying for project work and then basically being reimbursed at a third of that rate. Yes, I would be happy to chat specifics with you and some numbers. So, all right, getting through the chat. A couple people had to hop off, no worries. Can we call our 1940s theater historic, even if it is not listed on the historic register? Yes, absolutely. So we do not require any properties to be listed on the register to apply for our program. However, if it is a historic building, then you do need to use best practices for historic buildings. So you'll need to follow the historic standards with the project if that's your purpose, unless you're renovating it into a museum and not wanting it to be a theater anymore. But we would still want you to keep all that historic good stuff that's still there. What is the difference between the EO 2102 EZ form and the Section 106 EZ form? Great question. Is it Lisa or Lissa? So there's two different processes. One is the state level and one is federal level. 2102 is the state level, and that's why you're required to participate in that process as a state grant recipient. Section 106 is the federal level, and that basically supersedes 2102. And so if for any reason you need to go through Section 106, which means that there is a federal undertaking, is the phrase, which typically means like federal funding or a federal permit is required, then you have to do 106, and that's a different process and a higher process essentially. And so you don't have to do 2102. If you're required to do 106, then you just do that process and you don't worry about 2102. You will know when you talk to DAP, you will know if 106 is the one for you. That's not super typical for our projects unless you've are receiving federal funds for some reason, or maybe your part of your project is over a waterway or something that requires an Army Corps of Engineer permit or something like that. In that case, perhaps there's some federal involvement there, but DAP can, most of you will be 2102. DAP will be able to tell you if that's otherwise. In fact, DAP will probably be notified about your project if 106 is required, because the federal agency is required to work with DAP on those 106 reviews. So did that answer your question, Lisa?
It did, thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so basically don't need to bother with 106 until DAP tells you to, or the feds tell you to. All right, Russell asks, the EO 2102 is a state level. Oh, you're literally answering the question that I just answered. Great, okay. Louise, thank you so much. Okay. Barry asks, the contractors that we pay for work on the project and who we pay prevailing wage need to be licensed and bonded as contractors in Washington State. Yes.
They can't, yeah, they won't be able to get an intent filed if they don't have a contractor's license.
Yes. Lynn asks, can fundraising and grant management be included as a project-related expense? Great question. And unfortunately, the answer is no. That is a hard line. So yeah, any time spent, any resources spent fundraising or managing the grant cannot be matched. So that's a no. All right, Nicholas asks, what guidelines do you have for providing the statistics on public visitation, an average period like over the past year or when it was most recently open on a regular basis for the Ryan House? COVID and staff shortages here severely reduced the availability of open hours for the museum leading up to its closure. Great question, Nicholas. I would say we left it as very open-ended so that you could answer it in a way that makes sense for your organization. So for some people, they've got really good statistics on every year we have this many people, or every summer we have this, and every winter we have that. For your situation, what I would say, I would hope that you've got a little bit of data from before COVID and before the house was closed to be able to say, well, before all this happened, we were able to serve this many folks, and throughout, and these were our busy seasons, and about this many folks came through. And you can be the house has been closed for a while. You can be honest that there is not currently public visitation happening. And if that is the case, and I believe I pointed this out in the guidelines as well, if your property is closed or currently closed and not providing public access, and or you're building a new building that obviously is not going to provide public access until it's finished, then you need to describe your plan to provide public access in the future. And obviously you can't predict how many people will come through, but in the case of the Ryan House, you know, you could say we hope to get back to pre-pandemic levels or something like that. But yeah, that is a really important point. If your property is not currently open to the public, I would include some information and some language about how you plan to make it open to the public in the near future, preferably by the end of the grant project. Ken asks how detailed the cost of projects need to be for first stage. We have found the bids are proving way larger than first estimated. So Ken, we don't actually ask for any detail other than overall project cost divided into those 3 categories. But in the second stage, we will ask for all that detailed information about the bids, about the project, budget, all that stuff needs to be submitted later. So yeah, first stage, it's just overall project cost, and 1/3 of that you're asking for grant. Like that's what we want to see in stage 1. All right, David, this is a private message, so not everyone can see it, but I'll read it out loud. We have 2 donors that are interested in helping us get a building. Donor 1 has land valued at $1 million. Donor has metal prefab building donated at valued at $45,000 that has not been erected yet. Donor will give us the land, and donor 2 will give us the building. It can come up with the dollar. If we can come up with the dollar amount to pay to erect the building, if donor 1 gives me the notarized letter of intent to donate it, if I get funding, will that count as property under our control? Yes, great question. So in the case of property acquisition as part of your grant project, there does need to be a notarized letter of intent to sell or donate. So that is basically that the current property owner is committed to transferring that property under the agreed upon terms as part of this project. So that is outlined in the guidelines a little bit later when we're talking about some proof documents for match. And
It's also important to know ahead of time for that, though, that any material donated above $5,000 needs appraisal.
Yep, great point, David. So yeah, for a prefab metal building, we'll need an appraisal of that since it's clearly over 5,000. And for land value, so in addition to, because there's a property transfer happening here that has not yet taken place, so in addition to the commitment to that transfer, we also need to see a professional assessment of the land as well, or you can use the county assessed value. Often the market rate will be higher, so it can be advantageous to get that professional assessment of the property. But if you just don't have the means, or your project scope is such that the county assessed value is sufficient, then we can use that.
All right, thank you. Will a bill of sale on the prefab building be sufficient from the manufacturer to the donor as opposed to a independent appraisal?
Yes.
All right, great, thank you.
Yep.
That answers everything for now.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks, David.
All right, a couple more people have to hop off. I totally understand. This is a long meeting. All right, John asks, for the cost categories of the 3, could property acquisition be, quote, non-applicable? Oh, like you don't have any acquisition expenses? Yes, you can leave those blank. In fact, most people will leave property acquisition blank, except for I think maybe David. So yes, yeah, you're not required to fill in all those fields. Let me just pull that right back up. So yeah, these fields only fill in the ones where you have expenses. So if you're not acquiring property or getting property donated, those are going to be zeros for you. And like I said before, most people have like either all or 80% of their expenses in those first 3 boxes under construction and rehabilitation. Most of our projects are mostly that. but design and acquisition are eligible where applicable. All right, Holly asks, do the projects being used for match have to be within the building footprint itself, or does work on site which supports building operations count? For example, landscape upgrades and parking. It all counts, hooray, yes. Landscaping, parking, all of that definitely counts. In fact, if you have a site with multiple buildings, you can propose a project that covers multiple buildings as well. So for instance, I mean, they need to be, you know, sort of able to be described as a project, as a grouping. But speaking of Holly, we've funded Officers Row down in Vancouver as kind of a set of historic buildings that have received in one grant cycle funding for multiple buildings. The Okanagan Historical Society has a kind of campus of multiple buildings together, and we've given funds that go one large capital project that affects multiple buildings on that site. The one thing to be aware of if you're looking at kind of more than just one structure is that whatever the grant dollars or match is going toward, all of that has to be included as property data in the contract, and then is subject to that monitoring period for 13 years. So if you own multiple parcels and the work ends up going on to multiple parcels, then all of those parcels are subject to that monitoring. So may or may not be an issue for folks, but just something to be aware of, as kind of anything that match or grant touches gets monitored via parcel lines. All right, Peggy asks, what is public access for a performance-based theater where all performers/directors are volunteers? Is it public access only during performances? So Peggy, public access is not just the performers and directors, but the public coming into the building to enjoy the shows as well. So if you are having, you know, I don't know what is a reasonable amount of performances per year, but 60 performances per year. And I don't know if you track audience members exactly, but an average of 100 attendees per performance, that shows, you know, 6,000 people coming through your theater, and that's public access. So it's not just the people who work in the building, it's any of the public that comes into the building for the programming and opportunities you provide. So, and I mean, it has to be folks kind of interacting with your organization and the structure itself. Unfortunately, you can't sort of like estimate traffic that goes by on the road. It really does need to be people that are utilizing the structure, utilizing the building, and having public access to history through your property. You know, whether that's you know, Peggy, we've talked about like interpretation in a lobby about the historic building, and they're learning a little bit and accessing that history through the building that they're able to experience. Great question. All right, Lynn asks, we have to identify 75% of the match by June 7th, including pledged dollars. Yes, so this is moving into stage 2, but yes, 75% has to be sort of identified. It doesn't have to be in hand in the sense of like it's in your bank account, but it has to be, as Lynn kind of intimated here, pledged. So you can have, you know, a grant you're receiving in the future, or a donor who is planning to donate upon receipt of, you know, you raising this grant fund, something like that. It has to be sort of reasonably committed, and that's, you know, that's a bit of a squishy phrase, but just chat with us and let us know if you have any questions about what that means. So yes, 75% needs to be demonstrated by the June 7th deadline, which is stage 2. And then approximately 1 year later, when we can start contracting with you, you then have to show that the rest of that and get that up to 100% by the time we contract. So again, it's all kind of a bit of a numbers game, so these numbers can get a little confusing. So if you're trying to work out your budget and trying to work out all of these things, and you're just not totally getting the math, reach out to us, and using your specific numbers, it can be a little easier to understand if we go over it together. So, All right. Sonia asks, maintenance isn't allowed for match, correct? How is that determined versus upkeep improvements, i.e. landscaping, etc.? Yeah, so that's correct, Sonia. Maintenance is not permitted expense. So it really has to do, and maybe David can chime in here, it has to do with sort of the degree of upgrade. Essentially, it needs to be an upgrade. It needs to be an improvement, a capital improvement. So landscaping, if you're redoing a landscape, if you're taking out plants and adding a parking area and re-landscaping something, that's a capital improvement. Mowing the lawn and trimming the hedges is a maintenance activity. So there can be some area in the middle there where it's a little bit unclear. And in that case, I would suggest just reaching out directly and asking us if you about an activity that you're not sure if it counts as maintenance or capital, and we can help define that. The state has very specific rules about what is considered capital and what's not. So sorry, David, go ahead.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, all right, I covered it. But yeah, like I said, the state has some pretty significant definitions that we have to follow. All right, Kelly, does probative work count as part of a project? We have been investigating plaster cracks in our ceiling by structural engineer to determine what is causing this damage. Yes, yeah. So that's like it's assessment. It's building assessment. That counts. Very important. So somebody won or lost a bet there. Awesome. Okay, well that got through all the chat I can see. If I didn't get to your question, maybe it got routed not to me or to the alt chat. So we got another 7 minutes here. I would love to answer any other questions from folks. If you have them, feel free to type or just unmute and wave hand if anyone has any other questions.
On the last question, I would add that it would count if it's already a project, but if it's investigation just to find out what's going on, and you don't know what, you don't already have a project that this would be part of, it wouldn't be an eligible expense.
Yeah, so we've spent currently around 30,000 trying to figure out what is causing the ceiling to continue to crack, and it's got worse. It's obviously a safety concern. But yeah, as of now, there's been some anomalies the structural engineer has found in some of the permits from a previous renovation with the city. But of course, we don't have a solid concrete answer and would not move ahead with the historic plaster, preservation group to repair that until we can determine the cause. So I wasn't sure.
It sounds like you already have a project in mind, so that would be eligible. If it's fishing, if you have something that's going on that you don't know, and you don't know if you're going to be able to repair it, or if you're going to want to repair it, that's what I'm looking at is
Okay.
yeah, just exploratory stuff before you even have any idea what you're doing.
Okay, thank you.
The wording that OFM and the IRS uses is that it has a nexus in a real project.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yeah, it gets a little confusing there, and a good example that kind of clarifies that that we get asked a lot is people will say, well, can a feasibility study count? And a feasibility study is like, we have a building, but we don't know what to do with it. So that's not really a capital project. You haven't identified a physical work that you're planning to do at the site. You're trying to figure out what to do. So if you're doing an assessment for you already have the plan to do something with the building, and you're looking to assess the building and how to get bids or to know what work needs to be done, but you already kind of have a sense of, yes, we're going to be making these capital upgrades. We just need to understand the details of what needs to happen. That's an established project. So it just, I mean, as David used the terms nexus, and I think it has to have a kind of intent behind it, a specific intent. Cool. Other questions? Not, we can hop off early. Everyone gonna have a little break before their next meeting. Well, I hope this was helpful. And probably I'll be doing a very similar format in the next workshop with like the guidelines and the form side by side. As I mentioned before, I really tried to arrange the information so that that they could be really useful. In the past, the guidelines had been the information was kind of in a couple of different places and it was a little hard to follow and a little hard to know where to find what information. And so this time around, I really tried to rearrange it so it hopefully is an actual useful tool that you can kind of read the information you need to know as you're filling out the form that you have to fill out. So that was the goal. And so hopefully that proves useful to y'all. So thank you so much for joining. I know this was a long one. The next one will be another long one. But in the meantime, if you got questions about your numbers, your timeline, your scope of work, reach out. We'd much rather answer questions up front rather than have you spend time working on something that is incorrect or not eligible. So let us help you. We'll be in touch. So if you registered for this, I'll be sending out links and you'll have my email, and I can send those slides that were at the beginning. They have very little information about them, but reach out anytime. And we'll be talking to y'all again soon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.